Judaism is a relatively small religion, especially when compared to Islam and Christianity. However, it is one of the most well-known religions in the world, and with this popularity, there's bound to be some misconceptions. At number 10, all Jews support Israel. In fact, prior to World War II, there was a great controversy about whether or not there should be a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. There was also some controversy about what kind of homeland it should be. Some wanted to establish a Jewish cultural center within the Ottoman Empire. Others wanted a nation and state for the Jewish people and have a lot of political power involved in it. But today, many years after the establishment of the State of Israel, most Jews want to see a democratic Israel with secure boundaries and a place of peace, especially amongst their neighbors. Also, at the same time, many Jews disagree with the policies of the Israeli government. Rabbis are ministers. Well, not necessarily. Rabbis are expert in Jewish law, and until recently, it was quite rare for a synagogue to have a rabbi unless they needed to have someone make decisions about Jewish law. And on a whole, a synagogue needed a chazen or a cantor who could sing throughout the services. Now, many synagogues and Jewish communities operate without a rabbi, and usually you'll find rabbis among the Reform and Liberal Jews, but not necessarily all Jewish groups. For number 8, let's look at kosher laws. Jews keep kosher laws because it's healthier? Well, Jews actually keep kosher for one of two reasons. They are fulfilling the commandments in the Torah, or they are doing this for reasons of cultural identity. There are actually no specific health reasons for keeping kosher, although some health benefits may possibly be achieved. Popular Jewish teaching is that these commandments were given to Moses and Israel to distinguish them from other people around the world so that their eating could become a witness to the presence of God in the world. Number 7, Hanukkah is equivalent to Christmas. Well, no, it is not. It is not the Jewish version of Christmas. It is true that some Jews try to make Hanukkah a substitute for Christmas so that their children don't feel left out, but in actuality, it's a minor and not a major festival. The festival of Hanukkah really only happens in the evening when the candles are lit. Generally, stories of the Maccabees and stories of Judith are told. While the books of the Maccabees and the book of Judith aren't in the Jewish Bible, their stories are still seen as important. Number 6, let's talk about the Passover Seder. A common misunderstanding about Judaism is that going to the Seder represents the Last Supper. Although the Gospels in the Bible put the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples around the time of Passover and therefore Seder, there is no conclusive evidence that the Last Supper was a Jewish ritual known as a Seder. Most scholars say that the Last Supper was most likely an ordinary Jewish meal, and it is also said that the Seder began to be practiced sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, after the time of Jesus. For lie number 5, Jews have horns. Now, this is not so much a modern misconception, but it was a huge misconception in the past. In the Middle Ages, a widespread misunderstanding about a verse from the Torah resulted in false stereotypes and even murder of Jewish people. The myth came about through a Latin mistranslation of Exodus 34 verses 35 that says, "And the children of Israel saw Moses' face, that his skin became Karen, and Moses put a veil back upon his face until he went in to speak with God." Now, the Hebrew term Karen, which means radiance, was mistranslated by St. Jerome as Karen, meaning horn in Hebrew, and this led to artistic portrayals of Jews as devilish characters. Artists like Michelangelo even depicted a horned Moses, and the statue that Michelangelo created is actually in the chamber of the US House of Representatives today. Judaism prohibits birth control? Well, you'll find many large Jewish families, that's for sure. However, in Judaism, the actual biblical obligation to be fruitful and multiply, found in the Torah, in the book of Genesis chapter 1 verses 28 and also chapter 9 verses 7, is fulfilled by having simply 2 children, a boy and a girl. So to say that a religious couple is not allowed to use birth control would be a big misconception, pun intended. Orthodox Jewish couples generally consult a rabbi to evaluate whether or not they can use birth control and which methods are preferable. So yeah, it's really up to the couple, and it's not something that Judaism outright prohibits. Number 3, Jesus and his bar mitzvah. Let's look at this one. Regardless of whether or not someone believes that Jesus existed, there were actually no bar mitzvahs until the 10th century, which is 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. And apparently bar mitzvahs actually started to appear at about the same time as the separation of men and women in the synagogue. Up until that time, they sat together. Lie number 2, Jews follow Judaism. This is a huge one. Jews are an ethnic group as well as a religious group. Hence, you might identify yourself as Jewish, but not religious. But you couldn't be considered religious Jewish unless you were ethnically Jewish or had become Jewish. The issue of Jewish identity has its intricacies for sure. Usually a person is considered Jewish if their mother is Jewish. Certain groups, however, accept that a person is Jewish if they have one Jewish parent and are also brought up as Jewish. And finally, we made it to number 1, the biggest lie in this episode. All Judaism is found in the Old Testament. You can find stories related to Judaism and see the 10 Commandments and things like that, but biblical Judaism with the tabernacle and the temple and priestly services, animal sacrifices, all of that is not the Judaism practiced today. Judaism is a religion that is living and developing and has evolved to meet the times that we live in. There's also, of course, much debate around how much Judaism should change without deviating from its origins. But either way, all of what Judaism today is cannot be found in the Old Testament. Number 10 brings us Jews are a separate race. Now, when it comes to humans and human race, well, it's somewhat loosely defined as what a race actually is, but many people believe that Jews are a separate race completely. However, a person that is of any race can become a Jew. Now, if Judaism could be broken up and divided into anything, it would be an ethnicity, but a person does not need to be an ethnic Jew to become a Jew. The term Jew comes from Judah, who was the son of the Jewish prophet Jacob and the father of the Israelite tribe of Judah. Next up at number 9, we have Jews do not believe in a Messiah. Well, in general, Jews do not believe that Jesus was the Messiah as Christians do, nor like Muslims do. Jews believe that the Messiah will come from the line of King David and will rule the Jewish people during the coming Messianic age. The lie number 8 is anti-Semitic refers to only Jews. Well, you see the term anti-Semitic, it has come to mean prejudice or hostility towards Jews. But someone who is Semitic comes from a culture that spoke a Semitic language. This includes people who spoke Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, among others. And Hebrew, of course, is a very small minority, especially when you compare it to Arabic, which is a huge majority. Number 7, Jews reject converts. Converting to Judaism, no doubt, is not an easy task. And because of this, Jews appear to be very intolerant of others joining their faith. But converting is open to anyone who wishes to do so. It will just take some work. In general, regardless of the Jewish denomination, there's a minimum of a year that is required so that the potential convert can experience a full cycle of Jewish holidays. And during that time, conversion candidates, they study the Jewish alphabet, the Jewish laws, as well as basic tenets of the faith until a rabbi who is mentoring them sees that they're ready to fully convert. The lie number 6 is Jews don't work on the Sabbath. Shabbat, also known as the Sabbath, falls between sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. And during this time, a Jew is not supposed to do any work, which can mean several things. But not all practices are observed by every single Jew due to what work actually means. Now, the Torah does forbid field labor, treading a wine press, loading animals, doing business, traveling, as well as starting a fire on the Sabbath, which in later times has been interpreted to even mean not turning on a light switch. But again, because of the interpretation and workability of day-to-day life, not all Jews abstain from working on the Sabbath. Continuing now to number 5, Jews believe in heaven and hell. How it actually works is like this. Jews do not believe in a hell as described by most other religions. Jewish mystics, they describe a spiritual place called Gehinnom. And this is usually translates to hell in English, but a better translation would be the supernal washing machine, because this is exactly how it works. The way our soul is cleansed in Gehinnom is similar to the way clothes are washed and cleaned in a washing machine. Now, many do not believe in heaven or hell as places, but rather as levels of consciousness, and simply call it a world to come. But they're not referring to physical places. Moving on to number 4, this lie is Jews can't marry non-Jews. Although more conservative Jewish groups may be against this, the vast majority of Jews are allowed to and can marry a non-Jew if they want to. In the United States alone, intermarriage is very common among secular Jews. Approximately 79% of secular Jews in the United States intermarry. And this number is much lower than conservative Jews, which make up approximately 36% of the intermarrying. Continuing this episode at number 3, Torah is the Jewish Bible. So the Hebrew Bible, also called the Old Testament in Christianity, or the Tanakh, is a collection of writings that was first compiled and preserved as the sacred books of the Jewish people. Now the word Tanakh is actually an acronym, and that's derived from the names of the 3 divisions of the Hebrew Bible, which are the Torah, meaning instruction or law, also called the Pentateuch. Then there is the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the writings. So contrary to popular belief, the Torah is only a part of the Jewish Bible, not the entire thing. Now, perhaps one of the most outlandish lies in this episode at number 2, Jews have horns. Now, this is a misconception and lie that plagued Jewish people in the past. In the Middle Ages, there was a widespread misunderstanding about a verse from the Torah that resulted in false stereotypes and even murder of Jewish people. The myth came about through a Latin mistranslation of the book Exodus chapter 34 verses 35. There's a passage in there that says, "And the children of Israel saw Moses' face, that his skin became Karen, and Moses put the veil back upon his face until he went in to speak with God." Now the term Karen, which means radiance, was mistranslated by St. Jerome as Karen, which means horn in Hebrew, and this led to artistic depictions of Jews as devil-like creatures, all having horns, and artists like Michelangelo even depicted Moses having horns. Now the lie at number 1 is all Jews support Israel. Now the fact of the matter is, prior to World War II, there was a great controversy about whether there should be a Jewish homeland located in the Middle East. Now there was also controversy around what kind of homeland it was going to be. Some Jews sought to establish a Jewish cultural center within the Ottoman Empire, and others wanted a nation state of Jewish people with real political power. Today now, many years after the establishment of the State of Israel, most Jews want to see a democratic Israel with secure boundaries and one that is at peace with all of their neighbors. And also, there's many Jews that disagree with the policies of the current Israeli government. So it is a big lie to say that all Jews support the State of Israel. Recently, it's been reported that the Arab world viewed the US President Donald Trump as an opportunity to have peace between Israel and Palestine, as well as they believe that this will lead to normalization between Israel and other Middle Eastern countries. But to many looking in, the question is still asked, what exactly is the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and how does this affect the Middle East? To summarize the conflict, both Israeli Jews and Arab Muslims date their claims to the land back to several thousand years, to biblical times as a matter of fact. This conflict started to heat up in the past century when violence erupted in mandatory Palestine between the Israelis and the Arabs. That started from the year 1920. At that time, Palestine was under British rule, and the termination of the British mandate over Palestine, as well as the Israeli Declaration of Independence, started the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which began after May 14, 1948. From 1920, the whole region was known as Palestine under the British Mandate until the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. However, the Jews saw this land, considered Palestine, as their land. The Arab nations, however, argued that since the land had been occupied by Muslims for over 1,000 years, as well as the majority of inhabitants there were Arab-speaking people, then Palestine should be ruled by another Arab nation, let's say Syria, for example. But the arguments for the Jewish people to have the land were because the land was originally belonging to the Jews. The Jewish kingdoms had ruled several parts of Palestine for over 1,000 years, and that the land, especially Jerusalem, were very important to the Jewish religion. It stated that the Jews have been praying to return to their homeland for nearly 2,000 years, although throughout history the land known as Palestine had always been occupied by Jews to some degree as well. After the event of the Holocaust, where more than 6 million Jews were killed, they wanted a homeland for themselves. Following that, they were given large parts of Palestine, forming the modern country of Israel, because the Jews had already considered it to be their homeland before the Arabs got there. The Arabs, however, resisted this because they saw the land as theirs. Israel and other surrounding Arab nations fought viciously in several wars over the land, most notably the War of 1948 and the war in 1967. Now, the conflict continues in various degrees to this day. So we got a little bit of a summary of what the conflict is all about, but let's get into a little bit more specifics here. What exactly is Israel? Israel is the world's only Jewish state, and it's located on the southeastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. Upon the Israeli independence in 1948, the country formally adopted the name State of Israel. This was after other proposed names like Land of Israel, Zion, Judea, all of those were considered, but they were rejected. Palestine, on the other hand, is not a country, but rather a de facto state. Palestinians are the Arab population of the areas of land that Israel now controls, and those are referred to the territory of Palestine. The areas, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, make up the Palestinian territories, and these territories are considered by Palestinians as the State of Palestine. The Gaza Strip is controlled by Hamas, an Islamist fundamentalist group. The West Bank is controlled by Palestinian Authority, but under Israeli occupation. Now, despite Israel's separation from Gaza in the year 2005, the majority of governments and political pundits still consider that land to be occupied by Israel. Now, just to go further back into history to establish what Palestine actually is, the Romans had given Palestine its name when they conquered it from the Jews nearly 2,000 years ago. After the Romans were thrown out, Palestine had been part of one Arab or Muslim empire after another since the 7th century. But in World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated, they were stripped of their colonies, and Palestine was a small part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. The League of Nations then decided which areas would be considered sovereign nations, and they awarded 90% of the land that was stripped from the Ottoman Empire to the Arab states. And because of the war in 1948, around 700,000 Palestinians lost their homes, and this started a huge refugee crisis that is still not resolved to this day. Palestinians refer to this as Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic. Now, in solving this huge conflict, there are two main proposals on how this can be done. One of the proposals is a two-state solution, and pretty much this would establish Palestine as its own independent state in Gaza and most of the West Bank, and that leaves the rest of the land to Israel. Now, although this may appear to be a pretty clear-cut solution, both Israelis and Palestinians are still unclear of how that would work exactly. The other proposal is a one-state solution. Basically, Israel and Palestine will be just considered one state. But then what state would it be? Israel or Palestine? And what would that say to people that hold on to their Palestinian heritage as well as the Israeli heritage? Now, for decades, the question has been asked, is the land Israel or is it Palestine? So when it comes to the country of Israel, like, is it actually a country? Like, really, what's going on here? Starting off with the first thing I want to share. Israel is the world's only Jewish state, and it's located east of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Palestinians are the Arab population that come from the land that Israel now controls, and they refer to the territory as Palestine and want to establish a state by that name on all or at least most of the land that Israel controls. And this is behind a lot of the conflict. Currently, when it comes to the population, Israel has about 8.5 million residents. Now, there are a few million more than the Palestinian population, which now sits a little bit over 5 million. However, some sources bring that number up to 9.6 million, with over half of them being stateless refugees in different countries in the Middle East, Africa, as well as Europe. So the number of Palestinians are more, it's just that within the Palestinian state that number is less. Israel is also a parliamentary democracy and is comprised of legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Around 93% of the land is owned by the State of Israel, the Jewish National Fund or the JNF, and the Development Authority. The Israel Land Authority or the ILA manages the land, and the government issues long-term leasing rights for the land. Next thing to note is Israel has the highest concentration of high-tech and startup companies outside of the United States. Now, it has the highest rate of entrepreneurship in the entire world for women and people over the age of 55, and it also has the world's third highest overall. Now, getting more into the facts related to the Israeli and the Palestinian dispute, both Jews and Arabs date their claims to the land back thousands of years. However, the current political dispute started in the 20th century. The Jews had fled persecution in Europe and wanted to establish a nation for themselves in what was then an Arab and Muslim majority territory in the Ottoman Empire and later the British Empire. The Arabs, of course, they pushed back, and the United Nations created a plan to give each group a part of the land, but that completely failed. And after the conflict in 1967, Israel was left in control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are two territories containing large Palestinian populations. Now, the city of Jerusalem is also wrapped up in this dispute. It's a city between Israel and the West Bank, and the significance of the city dates back to ancient times, and it's home to some of the holiest sites in both Judaism and Islam. Naturally, both Israelis and Palestinians wanted to make it their capital, and the Jews say Israel was promised to us by God, so we want Jerusalem too. And how to split up Jerusalem in a fair way is still a huge dividing issue between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I did mention the West Bank, right? Now, what exactly is it? So, the West Bank is a portion of the land to the east of Israel. Now, it's home to nearly 3 million Palestinians, and Israel took control of it back in 1967 and has allowed Jewish settlers to move into the land. But the Palestinians and most other nations consider Israel's occupation of the land completely illegal and just straight up unfair. Now, one interesting fact about Israel, I know it's kind of random, but like per square kilometer, Israel has one of the highest levels of bird traffic in the world. The airspace above Israel is a bird superhighway. So every single autumn, over 5 million birds cross Israel's airspace, and they're heading to warmer temperatures in Africa. And when this happens, it literally causes a bird bottleneck, and you may want to stay indoors when this happens. Like, we know how birds like to drop those unexpected surprises when they fly over us. Yeah, gross, right? Now, Israel is the only country in the world that has the same name. It's located in the same place and speaks the same language as it did 3,000 years ago. Most of the Jews were forced out by the Romans into exile after the destruction of King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem back in the year 70 CE. But the Jewish people did not all leave. And at that time, Israel wasn't a country. So when the term ancient Israel is used, it often refers to the tribes and kingdoms formed by the ancient Jewish people in the Levant, which is an area that encompasses modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. And the final note I want to leave you off with is Judaism is a religion, culture, philosophy, as well as a way of life for the Jewish people. It is an ancient monotheistic religion, and Judaism is the 10th largest religion in the world. Judaism is the expression of the covenant that is said to have been established with the children of Israel by God. And the children of Israel became Israel of ancient times. However, the term Judaism stems from the tribe of Judah that was a part of ancient Israel. Now, this was a tribe that it was believed that the Messiah would be born and become the savior of the whole world. Alright guys, so that's all the information I have for you about Israel and Palestine. We saw some interesting facts, some random facts, some history. We looked at some of the conflict and everything. Now it's time for me to hear from you guys. I've said a lot, so what do you have to say? Sound off down below in the comments section.